Good morning and welcome. I'm Fred Kemp, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and it's an enormous pleasure to welcome you this morning to this important conference, both because of the conference itself and the attendees and speakers, which I'll talk about in a moment, but also because it's a capstone and culmination of a very important 18-month project, NATO in an era of global competition, which we conducted together with the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies and with our colleagues from the Ministry of Defense of Norway. This project was launched last year with a clear purpose to address the role and priorities of NATO and the broader transatlantic community in the face of emerging security challenges, global power shifts, new disruptive technologies, and a highly contested and unpredictable security environment. I was just talking to the Norwegian Defense Minister, and we also talked about how it also illustrates how bilateral relationships within a multilateral organization can push thought leadership forward and can push ideas forward and can create communities of influence that are quite important to the future of the alliance. When we launched this project in June, it was a different world. We launched it with a conference called NATO and the New Security Landscape, and only a few could have predicted the turbulence in the transatlantic partnership and the challenges that we've witnessed over the past year. Last fall at the second conference on NATO's deterrence and collective defense, we addressed this against the backdrop of the escalation of the Syrian conflict, the NSA revelations, which caused an erosion of transatlantic trust, which we've been attending to. And as we've moved on to our third conference, which took place this March in Oslo, we already knew Putin's annexation of Crimea and his subsequent efforts to destabilize Ukraine presented an enormous challenge for the alliance and the broader transatlantic community. And now, even as we look at this, we have to look to Iraq and Syria and see that situations as unstable as they were and as violent as they were have turned even more challenging. So with this complex set of issues in mind, we've prepared the final report of this project, which you'll find just outside of the lobby, but we'll continue working bilaterally and putting together these communities of influence because we know that the alliance has to be particularly nimble and particularly flexible in these days when the challenges are changing as quickly as they are. As the report states, when NATO heads of state convene in Wales this September, they'll confront one of the most serious set of challenges since NATO's birth in 1949 about how to respond to a newly aggressive Russia and security threats proliferating across the Middle East, including, as I said, Syria, and the rise of jihadism, including foreign fighters in Iraq. Can NATO be flexible enough? Can it be nimble enough? Can it adjust to this new world of challenges, even as troops withdraw from Afghanistan? As we believe, if NATO doesn't adapt rapidly and effectively to meet these new serious challenges, it risks irrelevance and it risks a loss of its credibility. Those are the stakes, and the stakes are enormous. And I think that the turnout today underscores what an important challenge we're facing, and it's a testament to what's at play. And of course, we have a larger audience also online and digitally with us. It's not surprising that we're looking at these issues with our friends and colleagues from Norway who have repeatedly demonstrated their outsized value to the alliance. Norway has been a thought leader on the alliance's future, and this is underscored all the more by the new Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, Prime Minister Stoltenberg, who was here at the Atlantic Council last week for a transition seminar and a set of meetings in Congress and elsewhere. So first of all, I want to start by thanking our partners at the Norwegian Ministry of Defense, led so ably by Her Excellency Ine Eriksen Søreide, who is here with us today. I'd also like to tip my hat to Policy Director Sven Efjestad, Director of Security Policy John Andreas Olsen, and Senior Advisors Christine Fjellstedt and Keith Akenes. It's been wonderful working with all of you over this period of time. I also want to acknowledge our partners at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies, Senior Fellow Michael Mayer, and his colleagues at the IFS who are also with us today. And last but not least, I'd like to thank our colleagues here in Washington, Ambassador Carreras and his team at the embassy. This has been a fantastic, long-standing cooperation. We've got a great lineup today. We're honored that General Brent Scowcroft has agreed to join us and open this event. After his opening remarks, we'll hear from the Norwegian Minister of Defense. We'll get a readout on U.S. administration strategy for Europe and NATO by Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Derek Chalet. And so it's a very good turnout and lineup of speakers. So without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to our guest of honor, starting with General Scowcroft, who will outline his vision for renewed transatlantic community. He's among the staunchest supporters of the Atlantic Council, and we're tremendously honored he serves as chairman of our International Advisory Board after having served twice as chairman of our board over the years. We're quite likely, we quite likely wouldn't be here at all as the Atlantic Council without his vision or commitment, where he saw at the end of the Cold War that there was a reason for the Atlantic Council and the transatlantic community to stay together. History wasn't over, and he had the foresight to see that we would be heading into a period of time where we would be far better off if we could continue to work effectively across the Atlantic. He's dedicated his career to public service, only person to serve twice as National Security Advisor under Gerald Ford and George H.W. Bush. I usually only add this next sentence when Henry Kissinger is here so I can rib him a little bit, but he was actually 3 times as National Security Advisor when he was Deputy National Security Advisor, and Kissinger was both National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, and everybody knows that even Henry Kissinger couldn't do both jobs. So, so 3 times National Security Advisor, but hope anybody who knows Henry Kissinger will pass on that I said that today. He serves on the President's General Advisory Committee on Arms Control, the Commission on Strategic Forces, the Blue Ribbon Commission on Defense Management, and the President's Special Review Board. So remains very relevant within this administration as he has in all others in the past years. And President of the Scowcroft Group, International Business Advisory Forum. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming General Brent Scowcroft.
Thank you very much for that kind and generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here with you all this morning, and I'm honored to be the one asked to get all of you started on the discussion of this excellent new report on NATO in an era of global competition. Before turning to substance, I want to acknowledge the efforts of the 2 organizations who have produced the paper which is the focus of the meeting today. As was just said, I have devoted a great deal of time to the Atlantic Council over the past several years. I'm a strong believer that this is an alliance that really actually knows how to fight together. But the question is, for what? And I will talk a little bit about the eras that NATO has gone through in talking about the and what now. But I'm delighted to see that it's once again pioneering innovative thinking about how we should deal with the current increasingly difficult global scene. I won't say anything more about the Council. I've already spoken so highly of the way it has developed that I need to preserve my credibility. I do, however, want to congratulate the Council's partner in this effort, the Royal Norwegian Ministry of Defense. And I'm very pleased to recognize Ine Eriksen Søreide, Norway's Minister of Defense, to thank her for her staff's support of and involvement in this effort. Madam Secretary, you're a bright light in the councils of the Alliance. I can't tell you how much your strong voice has been helpful on the need for a reinvigorated NATO. I would also point out that 2014 is about to come the year of Norway, since, as most of you know, Norway's former Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg will become NATO's next Secretary General later this year. I hope he gets an opportunity to read this report before he takes over. I want to be very clear this morning as to why I believe so firmly that NATO is essential and unique in today's troubled world. We should not forget why NATO exists. It exists as its foundational treaty states to safeguard the freedom, common heritage, and civilization of the member states' peoples, founded on the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. Now that stands in sharp contrast to much of what we see in the headlines we read every morning. And I would hope that when NATO's leaders meet in Wales in August, they use that opportunity in part to educate and remind their fellow citizens, particularly those under 30 years of age, who have only the faintest appreciation of this, why NATO exists and what it stands for. As an institution, NATO has been through a number of phases to which it has had to adjust. The Cold War, from its founding in 1949 to 1989, the immediate post-Cold War period, which saw new challenges in managing the evolution of the war-torn Balkan states and absorbing new members. And in this century, in addition to further expansion, new dangers have emerged, dangers which arose outside NATO's own landmass, but nevertheless, if unaddressed, pose threats to our core beliefs. Meeting in Chicago in May 2012 summit, NATO's leaders set forth 3 core missions for NATO: collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security. Those missions provide the intellectual framework for what we should be doing. The harder task is applying those principles to reality. I hope that at the Wales summit, the alliance heads of government take this on. The recommendations in your report, aptly titled "The Way Forward," provide an excellent roadmap for doing just this. They make clear that what NATO needs now is a reanimated blend of strategy, force capability, and exercise. And I want to emphasize blend. You can't have an effective military force if you don't have a clear political strategy for how NATO's 28 nations will work together. And you can't have an effective military force if you don't exercise it rigorously to meet its potential threats. Recent decades are strewn with examples of unpredictability and speed of geostrategic challenge and change. NATO must be an enduring force for stability and security. But to do so, its military forces must be able to work together on an interoperable basis and must be properly resourced. Similarly, recognition of the possibility of nuclear coercion or blackmail should also underline the need for nuclear forces assigned to the alliance, and I believe for the continued forward stationing of a small number of U.S. nuclear weapons in Europe. Finally, however, it is critical that we recognize we can't do any of this if we don't have the support of the alliance's citizens, which is why the recommendation about winning the battle of the narrative is so vital. There could not be a more propitious time to be having this discussion, nor a better venue than here at the Atlantic Council. I'm so pleased that the Council and the Norway Ministry of Defense have joined together to make this possible. Thank you.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us, and thank you, General, for your remarks, which I always spend days and weeks afterwards going back through to better understand the strategic
They're pretty opaque.
analysis. No, they're not. No, they were very clear. And so actually the first question they raise, I thought your sort of enumeration going back to the core documents of NATO's 3 missions, it was really important for us to remember, because NATO in this world doesn't have the choice of doing one thing and holding off on other things. And so the first question I have, and I think the key strategic question for NATO, because resources are limited, is how do you see NATO balancing among these priority missions? And in particular, there's the new challenges associated with collective defense that the Ukraine crisis raises, number one, but there's also an enormous number of growing challenges in the Middle East to NATO's southern members, and potentially ultimately in the form of terrorist attacks to any NATO member. And so it's a really difficult balance, and we would just love to hear your views on how does NATO strike that strategic balance?
That is really a very good question, and it's a very difficult question because NATO has a variety of perspectives in its ranks, and we have had to adjust several times since its founding, as I pointed out, to very different circumstances than that fundamental thing for which NATO was created. And I think that we need to adjust to a world that is endlessly and rapidly changing, beset by forces we've never really had to deal with before, and yet do so actively. And I think, for one, that we should contemplate changing somewhat the structure of how NATO does its decisions. And I would suggest that there are 3 kinds of issues that NATO ought to address. The first one is a decision that a crisis, take Crimea or any other crisis, is a NATO mission, and NATO itself should discuss it, should take it on. But there are many issues where the differences of views across the alliance are very, very strong. And I think there ought to be a second category where it is NATO becomes a coalition of the willing. Those who feel that an active NATO is right for the crisis can participate together and have access to NATO's infrastructure and so on. And the third category is no, NATO doesn't want any part of this. And it seems to me that is the kind of an alteration in the unanimity thing, which will allow NATO, which is likely to be faced, if the past several years are any indication, with a rapidly changing series of challenges.
I think that's a perfect model for the future. I know some of, especially for the world we're seeing today, I know some of the NATO traditionalists would consider the second suggestion heresy.
Heresy, but we have to look at the world as it is and as it's likely to continue in the future, and to have a rule of unanimity on everything. It seems to me could prevent us from doing anything.
I think that's right. It reduces flexibility.
We ran the risk of that in past years.
Yeah, I think that's right. Let's, if you don't mind, talk about Ukraine for a second. We had a gathering here in late April, the Europe Whole and Free Conference, where the Ukraine crisis was discussed for 2 days by the most senior officials from most members of the alliance. We had defense ministers and Vice President Biden, Secretary Kerry, and many others. And it still grips the alliance. We're still all even grappling with it at the strategic level. Is it a crisis that will like a hurricane has come, caused damage, and then will recede? We'll go back to normal after a year, after 2 years, after 3 years. Is this representative of a shift in the system that won't go back anytime soon? How do you see this at the strategic level? And then how do you think NATO should adjust in light of that?
Ukraine's been around a long time. And it has been an issue for a long time. Putin, for example, says that the collapse or the disappearance of the Soviet Union was the most cataclysmic event of the 20th century. Well, there were 3 elements in the collapse of the Soviet Union. One was President of Russia, Yeltsin. A second was the President of Ukraine, Kravchuk. And the third was the President of Belarus, and I can't remember his name. And they wanted to get rid of Gorbachev. And so they got rid of Gorbachev by pulling the Soviet Union right out from under him. And it disappeared, so he didn't have a job. And so Ukraine is right at the heart of some of the issues. It has been an issue for the alliance off and on. There have been discussions about inviting NATO, or inviting Ukraine to join NATO. And I think a lot of them have been discussions without going to the heart of how things are developing. Ukraine is a unique country in many ways. And in a technical way, Russia actually started as Ukraine in the 10th century. Moved up to the security of the woods around Moscow only after the Mongol invasion drove them out of the plains. So there's been this unusual connection all along in a variety of ways. And we have seen Ukraine go from, in the United States, from the center of our attention to, oh, Ukraine, where's that, sort of thing. And I think it's time that we recognize the unique history of Ukraine and the delicacy of dealing with it, and the recognition that it is actually an important part of Western Europe, an important part of Russia, and an important independent state in its own. It is really, in a way, it's really 3 countries. And I think we have to be wise in a very special way to monitor it through. And I think you can see the way that Putin has changed back and forth. I believe this crisis surprised Putin. I don't think it was his plan beforehand. But he has, from his perspective, the same kind of problems that we have from our perspective. And to me, an avenue out for Ukraine, which has enormous economic problems, would be for the US, Europe, and Russia to set up an economic program to try to bring Ukraine a modern economy.
So you think that the West, the EU and the US in particular, can cooperate with Russia economically to help Ukraine get on its feet and return to a more normal path?
Well, I'm not sure we can, and I'm not sure we will. But if you look at the past, over a year, there have been demonstrations in Maidan Square, back and forth and up and down, And here it was mostly yawning about them. Well, isn't that nice? Look at them demonstrating this and that. So this crisis has been going on for a long time before we had to take it seriously. And the fact is that Ukraine is a very unusual country in the unusual fault line of that region, and has been for 500 years or 1,000 years. And it's not going to go away. And we need to be, I think, try to be serious about it and see if we can't convince Putin to be serious about it.
I see. So in terms of NATO's measures to deal with this challenge, how would you assess the efforts so far? And I know they're continuing and they'll play out through the summit in Wales, but there's a lot of NATO members now that are quite nervous, and in many cases legitimately given their history, the Baltic nations and Poland and others. How have we handled this so far, and is there anything else you'd recommend?
I think so far it's been okay, and certainly Putin plays around with some of our other members in distasteful ways. It's not my sense that Putin wants this really to get out of hand. He spent about $50 billion or so on the Winter Olympics. He did that for a reason. He wanted to burnish his image. It's not likely that he had in his mind, as soon as he had spent that money and burnished his image, he would destroy it in Ukraine. So I think it's an emotional issue in many quarters, and that means we need to move judiciously. But I think that we can, well, I don't know. I'm not sure how to finish that sentence. I think we can make Ukraine an example of dealing with a country that is neither fish nor fowl in many respects, and dealing with it sympathetically and in a way which no one will feel raped.
I see. Thanks. Let me ask one more question, then we'll turn to the audience for a couple of questions, if you don't mind. Let me turn to the South, where there's equal challenges. In some cases, they could be at least as large as the challenge from the East, and that is the spread of virulent non-state actors who have an ideology that makes Al-Qaeda blush, that are in the headlines today. But you can see this continuing to get worse, in my opinion, in 6 months. Not just half of Iraq and half of Syria under this group's control, but potentially more instability in Jordan, in Lebanon, and Turkey, a NATO member, is right there, already suffering from some refugee concerns, but there are a range of other concerns that are growing. Does this group now have access to chemical weapons? I mean, I think NATO has to keep its eye on this ball too, because we don't want to, these challenges could be at least as great, at least as direct, at least as dangerous for the security of alliance members. What do you think should be done about this? Are we doing the right thing? How do we get ahead of this growing and very dangerous problem, in my view?
This problem in the Middle East is a particularly difficult one, because with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the last stages of World War I, and the growth of colonial territories, the Middle East was divided up by basically the British and the French and some the Italians and so on, into entities that had no rationale other than the map drawers of the British and the French and the other European countries. And now you say non-state actors. The Middle East risks to be non-state in its almost entirety. There are elements of civil war. There was, Lebanon fought a 17-year civil war. Syria is, Iraq. The disillusion of the nation-state system in the Middle East is something we have to recognize that could happen. And we are totally unprepared as to how to deal with that. I think we should not encourage it, but it's dealing with it, well, like Iraq right at the present time. There are several different courses of action. All of them are fraught with danger and warnings, we don't want to go there, we don't want to do this. But I think the Middle East, when we look at what's been happening in Syria and what could be happening in Iraq, is very dangerous. But let me just say that the Middle East is also a place where I think NATO acted wonderfully, and that is in the Libyan crisis. We went to the UN and got a UN resolution to authorizing the use of force to protect civilians. We organized NATO to apply that force, and we joined with the local regional security group, the Arab League, to prosecute that adventure. That, to me, is a good example of the way NATO can and probably should behave in crisis parts around the world. Evaluate what it means, not just to NATO, but to the world. Evaluate how to deal with it. And this is an alliance that, if we're thoughtful about it, is unique in world history. But we shouldn't forget that.
Thank you very much, General. I'd like to throw it open for one or two questions, if I might. And there's a gentleman in the back.
Make them easier than me. Bear.
I apologize, Bill Murray with Energy Intelligence Group. I may be provocative, so perhaps you won't force me to sit down now, but I did want you to talk a bit about Ukraine and the way it relates to, in some ways, the deep diplomatic mistake made by the European Union when they forced an all-or-nothing approach to the trade agreement back in November. It strikes me that you're talking about the fault lines in that region, but the people in charge of the negotiations, I guess mid-level diplomats, Polish and Swedish in particular, didn't seem to accept that Putin wouldn't react in a way that would be counter to what they expected. I mean, is there some kind of diplomatic misbehavior, or even just how do you account for this state of affairs taking place?
You pulled the cover off what I was trying to deal with a little more gently. We had not always paid a great deal of attention to Ukraine and what it was. We had this period where we wanted Ukraine in NATO, and this time it didn't seem to bother us much that the Europeans were sort of giving an ultimatum to Ukraine, Putin upped the ante, and until it became a crisis, we were pretty sound asleep on the issue in terms of how you handle this enormously complex country. You know, you take the Crimean part, that's a sort of an internal Russian part, because Crimea used to belong to Russia for a time. Russia gave it up to Ukraine, which was a part of the Soviet Union, drew the borders. we should have been familiar with it because the same thing happened in Georgia, where the borders were redrawn in the Soviet Union days, and it didn't matter because it was all inside the Soviet Union. It isn't anymore. And we're episodic in our attention to it. That's what I would say.
Any other questions for General Scowcroft? Yes.
Good morning, General.
Good morning.
Sorry.
Thanks for my question. Oh, thank you. My name is Dennis Nielsen. I'm from National Defense University. At the risk of being more provocative than the previous gentleman, I'd wondered if you could comment on the rationale for even being involved in the internal affairs of a country which is not part of the alliance, and whether that would increase the security of the alliance members or deteriorate it. I'm thinking of the historical example of Armenia, which was such a state between the Roman Empire and Parthia, and other similar examples throughout history, whether getting involved in the internal affairs of countries which are not part of the alliance can either help or hinder relations with other larger powers. Thank you.
Well, I think the answer is yes, it certainly can. But the United States, I think rightfully so, has seen itself as a force willing to deal with some of the more difficult problems of the world as they have emerged, and to do so in a constructive, helpful way, as I read the little pieces from NATO charter. That's what we're about. And you have to draw the line between rushing out to deal with every crisis around the world somewhere and lending a hand where issues are beyond the power of the local participants to resolve them. And Ukraine, one of the things I always visited when I've been to Ukraine is the horrible massacres where thousands of people are buried because of the kinds of differences and tensions that we have. I think the United States needs to participate in those things, and I believe that NATO does. And to me, NATO is a unique organization of the people in the world who believe most strongly about democracy, the rights of individuals, and the kinds of things that make life worth living. Now, what to me you're calling for is judiciousness in recognizing the kind of problems that can be, where an outside force can be helpful, the kind of resources that are necessary to do it, the kind of problems that can be dealt with and can't be dealt with. That's what NATO could be doing now and in the future. And I applaud it. I think it's exactly what NATO should be doing.
Well, General, I wish we had more time to continue this discussion. I'm very humbled and honored to be on this stage with you discussing these issues. Thank you for your insights today. And every day I'm humbled to be the director of the center that bears your name. But thank you very much for coming today.
I'm proud of you, my friend. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Vice General Scowcroft, thank you, Barry, for helping to kick this off. My name is Damon Wilson. I'm the Executive Vice President here at the Atlantic Council. Let me join Fred and Barry, and welcoming you to the Council. It's an honor for me to introduce to you our next session, which is really our keynote. And our keynote speaker, Minister Ina Eriksen Søreide, the Minister of Defense of Norway. In office since October, the Norwegian Defense Minister has already established herself as a major player within the alliance, and so we're delighted to welcome your voice to this debate today. And in part, this is because of the backing that Norway has brought to the alliance in its debates. Among the most capable armed forces, its contributions within NATO, whether to Afghanistan, Libya, or maritime operations, its singular defense role in the Arctic, a commitment to defense investment that's unparalleled in Europe today, but also, as we've talked about already and as we've seen in this effort, a real contribution and thought leadership to driving forward policy and strategy within the alliance. But the minister herself has added a particular touch, I think, to this effort and to this voice. She served for more than a decade as a member of parliament in the Norwegian parliament representing the Conservative Party. And there she chaired the Committee on Foreign Affairs. Excuse me. There she chaired the Committee on Foreign Affairs and Defense as well. So she came prepared, very much prepared to this job. Politically, she's brought a voice that has been rock solid on its commitment to NATO, the transatlantic relationship, and strong defense. But really has also brought an openness and an ability to translate defense and security issues to a broader public audience. She's had this unwavering commitment to the idea of NATO's collective defense and its core capabilities, while also providing this fresh voice, helping to explain the importance of this to often skeptical publics. When we last met in Oslo in March, it was just in the wake of Russia's annexation of Crimea, and we had an immediate conversation about the impact on this for the Wales Summit agenda and NATO strategy. We've had a little bit more time to reflect since then on how the alliance thinks both about the short-term aggression in the east, insecurity in the south, the importance of its collective defense commitments, but also to take into account the continuing long-term global trends that we've been discussing and what that means for the alliance's role in cooperative security. The minister has had at the core of this strategy that any healthy NATO means a healthy transatlantic bond. I've been struck by how you've spoken to audiences in Norway and in Europe, telling European audiences that you cannot take the United States for granted, and that the key to better burden sharing and a sustainable foundation for the future of transatlantic cooperation is for Europe to do more. So as we were talking to our Pentagon officials about this effort and this conference and the fact that we would be hosting the minister, a senior DoD official said something about the minister, which I asked if we could use in our introduction of you today. And the senior administration official said, the Norwegian Minister of Defense brings to NATO a serious purpose and a Norwegian pragmatism that is wrapped in a grace that is rarely seen around the table at NATO headquarters. So with that, Madam Minister, let me invite you to the podium to offer this keynote. Thank you so much.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, kjære venner. I could say in this audience, a lot of Norwegians here. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be back here, to speak to you this morning. It's extremely nice to have good friends in the Atlantic Council, and I'll get back to that in just a minute. We have a long-standing relationship between the Ministry and the Atlantic Council, between IFS and the Atlantic Council, and it's been really prosperous over time. And this has been of great value for Norway, for the Ministry, for IFS, for me personally, and I'd like to take you back to my first trip to Washington as a minister. Then I visited the Atlantic Council. We had a roundtable discussion. That was one of my first introductions to, well, Atlantic Council first and foremost, but also a lot of the people sitting in the room right now. It was, to me, a very rewarding session. I learned a lot. I had good discussions with people, and I have several times since that come back to those discussions we had. And 18 months ago, we formalized our cooperation. It felt like a very important to work with policy communities in Washington that had a real interest and also felt a real responsibility towards Europe and transatlantic security. So the value of the work that has been done has clearly shown, especially over the last months. stability and security in Europe has once again become highly relevant. And I'm convinced that the experience and expertise that exists here in this room and in all the other offices in the Atlantic Council will become even more important in the future. I am so happy that we have now decided to continue and prolong our cooperation beyond this current project. I'm also looking forward to reading the report. Obviously, I haven't been able to read it yet, but the rumor has it that it is a very good report, and I'm very excited to see what it entails. So the last time I was here was in January, and I laid out my government's view on transatlantic security, and since then, a lot has happened. In Ukraine, we've had a stark reminder that peace and stability in Europe cannot be taken for granted. And in my humble opinion, the Norwegian policy has been validated in many ways. And the reason why I say that Ukraine is a stark reminder is because, unfortunately, many thought that Europe had entered into a post-conflict era. There has been a dominating notion that in Europe, concepts such as military incursions and illegal annexation of other states' territory only exist in history books. That has been proven false. And I would like to echo what Fred said in the very beginning. He said that history isn't over. I think that's a very good reminder these days. But I do sense in the international debate a discussion whether what is happening in Ukraine is a crisis or more fundamental shift. And my view is that this is not a temporary situation or a temporary crisis. The security landscape of Europe has been fundamentally changed. Regardless of whether we are able to find political solutions in the short term, near term, on what is happening in Ukraine, the change that has occurred in Europe is enduring. And here I would also like to echo what Brent said in the panel discussion here. We have to look at the world as it is and how it is likely to develop in the future. This is where we are now. And no matter how the current situation is resolved, one important fact remains. NATO has a neighbor that has demonstrated the capability and the will to use military force to annex territory in Europe. This does not necessarily mean that there is a direct threat towards other European states. But this fact needs to be taken into account as we establish NATO's political and military posture for the future. This fact has, in my opinion, profound implications for NATO. Norway has argued for many years that NATO needs to strengthen its collective defense capabilities. In fact, some of you may remember that we issued a policy paper in 2008, before the Georgia crisis, that addressed this issue. We argued in 2008 that NATO needed to improve its ability to credibly address allied nations' security concerns, regardless of where they stem from. We also stressed that NATO needed to refocus on security challenges closer to home, applying to all parts of NATO. And this principle, in my opinion, still holds true. Currently, NATO is rightly focusing much of our efforts in Europe in the north and east. However, it's important to note that there are serious security issues in other regions of Europe as well. Iraq and Syria remind us that NATO also borders the Middle East, and also the volatile situation in North Africa causes concern for a number of our allies in the southern Europe. These areas also required allied attention, and NATO must be able to address the full spectrum of security challenges across the entire NATO area. And we must be able to do these things concurrently. So we need to reinvigorate NATO, and that predates this current crisis. Still, the situation in Ukraine lends more urgency to this point. Norway has pointed to a number of areas where we believe improvements should be made. and have suggested some specific proposals on how to achieve this. The fundamental principle is to strengthen our ability to conduct the full spectrum of allied missions, including collective defense. And I would like to highlight 5 key points. Firstly, the alliance needs better situational awareness. We need a better insight into the surrounding security environment. It is a paradox that NATO seems to be caught off guard when crises such as Crimea and Georgia occur. Our lack of sufficient situational awareness damages our credibility. It impairs our ability to provide for collective security. To address this deficiency, we believe that there needs to be a better sharing of intelligence among allies. Furthermore, the different NATO commands should have distinct and clear regional responsibilities. National headquarters needs to be linked up with NATO's headquarters. This would allow nations to feed operational pictures directly to NATO. Secondly, NATO needs a more robust and effective command structure, which can conduct the full spectrum of alliance tasks in an effective way. Linkages between NATO and national and NATO commands also play an important role in a collective defense scenario. In a real crisis, an Article 5 situation, we would expect SACEUR and also SHAPE to assume command. However, the national commands would have to play an important role as well. And in order to ensure effective command and control in a time of crisis, we need much closer links between national and NATO headquarters. Thirdly, NATO needs to take a hard look at readiness level of our forces. During the past decade, many of our allies have structured their forces so as to generate smaller contributions to crisis management operations out of area. We've generally not focused on the availability of the full spectrum of forces and capabilities, such as we might need in a time of crisis on NATO territory. As a start, we should review current readiness requirements for NATO reaction force. Rapid reaction for NATO should mean days, not months. In order to conduct collective defense operations, SACEUR needs to have available the proper forces and capabilities where and when needed. My fourth point is that NATO needs to update contingency plans. Norway has argued this point for years. I'm glad to note that there is now real progress in this area. For us, this is not necessarily related to the current crisis. Our point has rather been that as an organization tasked with providing collective defense, NATO needs credible plans to actually conduct collective defense if we need to. It is really as simple as that. My fifth and final point is that we need to do more training and exercise within the alliance. The Connected Forces Initiative provides a very good starting point, in my opinion. Exercises need to be based on realistic scenarios. We need to exercise our ability to conduct high-end, full-spectrum scenarios. Future exercises need to provide for reassurance and also deterrence and focus on interoperability. As some of you may know, we have now offered to host NATO's high visibility exercise in 2018. I think we will know the result in some weeks or maybe a couple of months. But NATO is moving from a period of high operational tempo to a period of high exercise and training tempo. It's important that policies keep up with this development. How, where, and when we train and exercise are all important political issues. We need sound policies in place as we develop the Connected Forces Initiative further. I believe that on these 5 areas, it will be crucial in making NATO into a more capable, more relevant, and more robust military alliance. But in order to succeed in achieving this goal, we need to focus on the health of the transatlantic relationship. I want to address two key factors in this. Firstly, one of the foundations of the transatlantic relationship is US leadership and engagement in Europe. The US response to the current crisis, particularly to reassure allies, has been robust. The European reassurance package sends a clear signal to allies, but also a clear signal to Russia. The events this spring has shown the value of NATO as a political alliance. Through NATO, Europe and North America have demonstrated unity and sent very powerful messages. The issue of US leadership in Europe is very much an issue of political leadership. The US role in the formation of the alliance is the prime example of this. But also the end of the Cold War, NATO's first out-of-area operations in the Balkans, and our undertaking the ISAF mission are examples. When fundamental changes to the European security environment have happened in the past, US leadership has always been crucial. This is described well by James Baker in his book, The Politics of Diplomacy, which deals with the end of the Cold War. He explains that the administration feared after the collapse of the Soviet Union that, quote, that the centripetal forces operating on the West were likely to be just as strong as the centrifugal ones, end quote. The conclusion in Washington was that the United States would have to lead in Europe and manage the post-war transformation. This is an important lesson from history. As we face a new fundamental shift in the security landscape of Europe, this type of US leadership will be as important as ever. To sum up this point and to be absolutely clear, US leadership is needed, it is desired, and it is welcomed by European allies. But US leadership cannot be taken for granted. And this brings me to the second point on the future of the transatlantic relationship, the question on how Europe can contribute more to the partnership. At the NATO Defense Ministerial earlier in June, allies were in full agreement that the US plans for reassurance in Europe are highly welcome. Norway shares this appreciation. At the same time, there is a real risk that we Europeans interpret the new package that was launched as a signal that the US will do more and that we are off the hook. On the contrary, I see this as even a further challenge to Europe, accentuating the need for us to respond by increasing Europe's contributions to collective security. I've used the term earlier, Europe needs to do our part, Europe needs to do more. And we do need to invest in our own security. I mentioned earlier that the US has demonstrated its commitment to collective defense in Europe. A related question is whether European allies can say the same. Looking back at the past 5 years, where Europe has made deep cuts in its defense budgets, for reasons related to the financial crisis, it could be argued that Europe needs to recommit to collective defense. There are different ways to achieve a better burden sharing and strengthening of the European pillar of the alliance. Multinational cooperation is always challenging, but it can be a very effective tool. The key is to maintain focus on the actual capability development. NATO's Framework Nations concept and the UK's Joint Expeditionary Force concept are both interesting to Norway because they actually do address capability shortfalls and they do aim to provide real increases in capability. Another example of how we can improve burden sharing is for Europe to engage more in those areas where the US has security interests, such as in the Asia-Pacific. Norway has not criticized the US for its strategy to rebalance towards the Asia-Pacific. On the contrary, we believe that US engagement in this part of the world is natural, and indeed that it is also crucial for global stability. What happens in the Asia-Pacific will have global impact and could have consequences also for Norway. Therefore, we need to be engaged. That is the reason why we, for the first time, will participate in the RIMPAC exercise. Our frigate is a small contribution to the larger scheme of the exercise and will probably not change its course. But the skills and the experience that we gain by exercising with allies and partners are important both for Norwegian and for our mutual security. But I would like to underline that our participation also sends a broader message. Norway cares about US security interests, even halfway across the globe. This is what being allies is all about. And for us, it's the very core of collective security. I look forward to learning more about the situation in the Pacific theater and how Norway can be supportive when I visit our frigate in Hawaii next week. As I say, duty calls. There's not much I can do aside from going to Hawaii. It's hardship, I can tell you. But in order to fully address the issue of better burden sharing, there is no escaping that the European allies need to spend more money on defense. Many have said the same earlier, and I'm very sure I'm not the last one to address this issue. But when sitting, not only outgoing US defense secretaries has this as a vital part of their speaking points, we need to pay attention. As a start, we need to stop the decline in defense spending. Cuts will need to be reversed. We need to agree on a way in which we, over time, can achieve the goal of spending 2% of our GDP on defense and 20% of our defense budgets on investment. I realize that this is a huge challenge for all countries, and it will demand tough choices everywhere. But we can no longer dodge the issue. It will take time. But until we get there, we need to make sure that the money we do spend is spent on the right capabilities. The spending targets that we set make little sense if we're spending money on the wrong things. Norway has chosen to transform our armed forces and invest in high-end capabilities such as transport aircraft, new Aegis frigates, F-35 combat aircraft, a full modernization of the army, and we're also developing a new family of highly capable precision-guided missiles, the NSM and the JSM. We believe that this constitutes an important contribution, not only to our national security, but also to the capabilities of the alliance. To conclude, there is reason to believe that the change to the security landscape in Europe will be enduring. NATO faces a new situation wherein we will have to reassess our assumption about Russia and its intentions. This has significant consequences for NATO. We need to reinvigorate NATO. We need an alliance that is robust, capable, and credible, and that has the ability, on a short notice, to perform the full range of NATO's tasks, including collective defense. The effectiveness of the alliance depends on the health of the transatlantic relationship. This, in turn, is dependent on strong US leadership and commitment to European security, and on a demonstrated willingness on the part of Europe to invest more in our own security. Norway will continue to invest in relevant capabilities and support a better transatlantic burden sharing. As I've said before, collective defense is about much more than what the US can do for Europe. I've spent time now describing challenges that NATO faces, but I also offered some solutions. And I realize that I may come across as a bit gloomy and pessimistic, but as a Norwegian Lutheran, that is perhaps as it should be. But I believe that we need to be frank in our assessment of what needs improvements and where the deficiencies lies. I'm a strong believer in NATO. I'm a strong believer in the transatlantic relationship. As the primary global military and political alliance, NATO has been a source of stability for more than 60 years. The need for a strong NATO will only increase in the time ahead. I believe that the alliance will continue to ensure the stability and collective security in the North Atlantic area. There is no institution like NATO which can form a common transatlantic approach to current and future challenges. That is what makes NATO unique, and that is why we, both the Europe and the USA, need to invest in the future of the alliance. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.
Madam Minister, thank you very much. We have until about 10 o'clock, and so I just wanted to continue the conversation. First of all, you're only gloomy if you actually don't offer solutions or demonstrate political will. And I think in your remarks, you just frankly demonstrated the Norwegian trait of pragmatism and put 5 practical, pragmatic solutions on the table, as well as, I think, articulating with some clarity the political will that backs up your positions here. So I wanted to pick up on I think the fundamental point that you were getting at towards the end of this health of the transatlantic bond, not taking U.S. Leadership for granted, but that requiring European commitment in kind. The Atlantic Council was in Poland hosting the Wrocław Global Forum when President Obama visited Warsaw and announced the European Reassurance Initiative, and announced, to the surprise of some in Europe and some in Capitol Hill, that the United States was willing to make a commitment to European security, $1 billion investment, the European Reassurance Initiative to support U.S. exercises training. And just this past week, as we were talking about before, we had some time up on the Hill with a series of senators, Democrats and Republicans, whose political instinct was, yes, given what's happening in Europe's East, this is exactly the kind of thing we need to do. But there was a big but there, which you were hitting on. Their but was, if we're expected to put more in, $1 billion in sustained exercises and deployments, this is only sustainable and frankly politically viable if we see a commensurate reaction on the part of Europeans. So you just led with a strong message about the need, warning European colleagues not to see this as translating into we are off the hook, being off the hook. How do you see the prospects of helping to stop the decline, reversing this? And at least if not, I don't think anyone expects the alliance to come out and all of a sudden we're at 2% across the board of defense spending by the time of Wales. But at least by the time of the summit in September, getting the sense of momentum that the U.S. recommitment to European defense is leveraging a European recommitment to its own defense. What do you think are the prospects of that?
So, that's a tough question, actually, but I'll try to come near some of the problems, at least. I think that for a very long time now, there has been a discussion within the alliance on the 2% target, which I think is important. And I have not seen any ally backing away from that goal. At the same time, I think it has, to a certain extent, been an excuse for not discussing how we spend the money we actually do allocate today. And that has maybe led to the fact that we've lost some years in trying to invest in the most both strategic and necessary capabilities. So we've all been so focused on the 2% or not 2% that we've not actually discussed what we should be discussing for some time now. I think there is a momentum now, as you say. I think there is likelihood that there will be some sort of declaration on the summit linking this up to either a percentage goal or at least to try to stop the decline in the defense budgets. And of course, different countries approach this differently. There are some countries who have now increased their defense spending quite a lot, but they come from a very low level. And we have countries who spend quite a lot of money on defense, but not necessarily on the right things. And we also need to see this as, in the framework of the whole alliance, what are we able to do as an alliance if something happens, if we need to push the big button? So I think that we have a momentum, and I am going to, of course, on every ministerial I started now in the beginning of June, but I will continue both in ministerials and in meetings with my European colleagues to actually remind them that even though we see a very welcome American initiative now, we cannot take it for granted, and it is still, I think, highly likely that the comments on the Hill will continue to be along the lines of why should we invest money, not only political will, but money in European security if they're not able or willing to do it themselves. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a very good reminder that you pick up. I bring it on back to Europe as well.
Well, thank you for doing that. I want to pick up, you said in your remarks that what we're seeing unfold in Europe right now, I want to come closer to home as we think about what's going on in Europe's east. This isn't a temporary crisis, I think is how you put it, that this change in Europe is potentially enduring. And so in some respects, you also pointed out that even before Georgia, Norway had been pushing the idea of more core capabilities, the collective defense mission. And you emphasized the issue of deterrence, sort of traditional NATO strategy here. And so as you think about what's unfolding in Europe's east right now in Ukraine, are we on track? Do you think the alliance is taking the appropriate measures to not just manage a crisis for the coming weeks, but to actually deter Vladimir Putin from further aggression using force of arms in Europe's east? And I want to link that to what you said. Rather than just reassure allies, you kept using the verb reinvigorate, which I think is a key point of how you think about alliance strategy, not just to reassure those that are insecure within the alliance, but if you are thinking about deterrence, our audience isn't just reassuring the Balts, our audience is actually more in Moscow. So are we headed in, we failed in 2008 to deter. Are we on a better track right now, do you think?
I think that what has been done so far, the fact that we now have 28 countries doing things for the alliance in reassuring our Eastern allies is an important step. And I've also said that I've welcomed the American initiatives, especially in the Baltic countries and Poland. But I do think that they, over time, need to be put under the umbrella of NATO because it makes it easier for smaller allies to contribute to this. And I hope that we can see that leading up to the summit. At the same time, I think that it's extremely important that in the situation we are facing, and that will change the landscape quite fundamentally, we cannot shy away from being a military alliance. We cannot shy away from doing what we are supposed to do. We are supposed to reassure allies, we're supposed to protect Allied territory, and although there is no threat against Allied territory as we speak, we need to make sure that a potential aggressor, be it Russia or anyone else, this is not only about Russia, understands where the borders and boundaries of NATO lies. That's a red line, and we need to be able to actually conduct what we are supposed to do if that was to happen. And I think that it lies an important message in what we're doing in the Balkans right now. I think it's an important message that we have been able to be unified on this. Mm-hmm. Of course, there are some differences when discussing with different countries and allies. I don't think that's a strange thing. I mean, we're 28 allies spanning over quite a large geographic area. So that's not a strange thing. And we have different security concerns in different parts of the alliance. But nevertheless, I think that we've come across with quite a clear message this time. And I think it's important that we actually do not shy away from the fact that if there is a crisis, if something was to happen, we are a military alliance.
Right. Let me ask one more question, and I want to bring in the audience. So catch my eye if you have a question for the minister before we wrap up this session. It is pretty remarkable that in the midst of a crisis in the East, Norway is participating in the reassurance missions. You've been building quite a bit, almost singularly, the defense presence for the alliance in the Arctic. And you're off to Hawaii. You're off to the Pacific. Which I think is a pretty strong political signal when there's been much debate in Europe about what the U.S. rebalancing posture means, that you're making a point of embracing that. And you addressed that in your remarks, but can you play that out a little bit more of how do you see Norway, and I guess more importantly, allied interests in Asia and in the U.S. role in Asia? Why is it worth both the commitment of resources to send a frigate to participate in the exercise in the Pacific, but even carve out a fair chunk of your time to politically fly the Norwegian flag as part of this exercise as well. Can you make that case to a Norwegian public? Do they understand? Did they understand this?
Well, I haven't asked them directly.
But I saw you speaking about this in
yeah,
Norway.
absolutely. I've been giving speeches on this.
Yes,
and,
yes.
And my impression is that a broad audience in Norway really understands that for a small country like us, situated where we are, we need to pay attention to security interests other places in the world than only in our own neighborhood. And as you say, there is, in addition to the benefits that we have from exercising and training with our allies, it is for us also a very clear political signal and message we would like to send by participating. We had a very good session at the ambassadors last night focusing on Asia, and one of the participators came over to me afterwards and said he was so happy that we contributed a frigate to RIMPAC. He said, the political signal is the most important. You could send the canoe and still be well off with the Americans and others. So next time maybe we'll try to send a canoe or anything else. No, but I think it's important also because we have over time tried, and I will say in a certain degree succeeded, in drawing an American attention to the High North, to our areas of concern. We see that we need a stability in the High North that affects the whole of Europe, it affects the transatlantic relationship and so forth. At the same time, we have to pay attention to security interests other places in the world. And what is more natural than for us as a predictable and a good ally to then pay attention to the Asia-Pacific? As I said, we have not criticized the pivot or the rebalancing, or call it whatever you want, because we find it natural. We say that someone has to pay attention to the security challenges that could have global effects. Look at what is happening in the Asia-Pacific. We have territorial disputes, we have nationalism, increased defense spending. If no one pays attention to what is happening, it could potentially be damaging. That, again, does not mean that we see now a potential threat from any country in the region, but things happening in the region could possibly affect also other places of the world. So that's why we contribute.
Thank you very much. It makes me want to
with a big canoe.
It makes me very much want to take you up to Capitol Hill with us the next time we go, so our members of Congress can hear. I've got a lot of questions. We've got a great expertise in the audience. Let me collect a couple for you.
Please.
And we'll, let me turn first to Jill Doherty from CNN right here in the front, please, one of our upcoming moderators. Yes, introduce yourself for our audiences and brief questions so I can get a few, and I'll come back
Jill
to you as well.
Doherty, most recently at the Shorenstein Center at Harvard University,
that's right.
and then soon to be at the Wilson Center. I have a question about Russia. Where do we go with the NATO-Russia agreement of 1997? Do they have a role anymore? So many things have been put on hold. And when General Scowcroft was talking about values, the first thing he said was this is an alliance based on values. Where does Russia stand? Do they deserve to be part of this at all?
Terrific. Thanks, Jill. Let me pick up our Norwegian colleague here as well in the back, please. Get it.
Thank you. I'm Anders Romerheim from the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. So far we've talked more about canoeing to Hawaii than about Germany. And while that's great, I'm curious if you would just talk a little bit about Germany. What is their future role in NATO? Is it evolving with the economic situation in Europe? And what does that mean for the alliance in general? And also, if you could relate it to the Norwegian-American bilateral relationship. Thank you.
Terrific. And let me just pick up Hans Benendijk as well. We'll bring these three questions back to you, Madam Minister, right there in the back, please.
Hans Benendijk from SAIS and RAND. And let me start by just echoing Damon's comment that I found your presentation really very refreshing, not at all gloomy, and I wish we could get 27 other defense ministers lined up with everything you said. My question really is closer to your home, and it's about Sweden and Finland. If I were living in Helsinki or Stockholm and looking at what has happened in Ukraine, I'd be very concerned about the nature of my insurance policy. I mean, they're relying on partnership as an insurance policy, and it really hasn't worked in Ukraine. So my question to you, and this is being reconsidered now in both of these countries. I know the public opinion situation there. But what is your advice to your neighbors about membership as opposed to enhanced partnership, which is where they are trying to go now?
Terrific. So we'll go from Russia to Germany to Finland and Sweden. You've got the European terrain, Madam Minister.
Well, I'll try to. To start with Jill's question about Russia, it's a very good question. Where do we go? As you know, we have, alongside most other allies, now suspended. The word just missed me. Suspended our military cooperation with Russia to the end of the year. And I don't see right now what could pick up some sort of normality, although we have still a cooperation when it comes to Coast Guard, Border Patrol, and so forth, because it's in our mutual interest. But I think that when we had some discussions, both within the alliance, but also among countries in the alliance on the Founding Act, I found it a bit disturbing because it seemed like all measures NATO took would in one way or the other bounce against the Founding Act. I don't think they do. I think that what we are doing are well within the borders of the Founding Act of '97. And allies have been putting together their defenses and defense budgets as if Russia was a strategic partner. That is about to change, and we need to change and adapt to that fact. So it could be tough, but I think we need to do that. Then to Anders. Germany, also a very good question. And I just want to correct you, I'm not canoeing to Hawaii, just to make sure that fact is laid out. But I think that when it comes to Germany, we've had very good talks. I visited my German colleague in Berlin not long ago, and we had very good talks about the situation, what we see developing. I think it is extremely important to engage Germany in a very good dialogue on both the future of NATO and also what the European allies should do. And there is still quite much a debate within Germany on how much and where they should engage both militarily and how much emphasis they should put on the alliance. Once again in Munich, there were 3 speeches, both from the president, the foreign minister, and defense minister, saying that Germany is too big a country to watch events from the sidelines. But yet we have still to see what that entails in practice. And I'm quite, I would say, although I said I was a gloomy and pessimistic style person, I'm not actually, but I'm quite optimistic that what is now happening will bring new dynamics into the discussion leading up to the summit, and also Germany taking on an important role in the European part of the transatlantic relationship. And I know that the Atlantic Council also wants to engage bilaterally and trilaterally with Germany and also Poland, which I think is very good. It's a good contribution, in my opinion. Then to Sweden and Finland and give them advice. I think that would be extremely wise now with the elections coming up in Sweden. But I know that my colleagues from Sweden and Finland, if they could apply for individual membership in NATO, they would do. The public, though, as you say, have not the same opinion at the moment. I think that I should be careful not to overanalyze, but I think that, once again, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, I'm coming back to him a couple of times, he participated in a seminar, the big defense seminar that Sweden hosts every year in Sälen. It's in January. And he was there a year and a half ago, and the discussion was, once again, that Sweden probably felt that they had NATO at their backs if something was to happen. Then he was very frank, and he said, no, Article 5, collective security, is only for members. And at that point, I think it started to cause a bit of a debate in Sweden. And then the debate went on, but I think that what is happening right now is something that makes his word from a year and a half back become even more valid. And they realize that it is a different situation and they have to adapt to it. Sweden are now doing, in my opinion, looking like good things with their defense spendings and investments. In Finland, we also have the situation where, and this is new, where the Finnish defense minister says that what is happening in Ukraine is pushing us closer to NATO. That is unheard of from a Finnish defense minister. At the same time, he was canceling his meeting with Shoigu in April or in March. And not only did he cancel, he didn't want to go to St. Petersburg to be part of some sort of a propaganda stunt. But he told the press exactly why he didn't go. That is also new. And at the same time, Sweden and Finland are so closely linked that I don't think you'll see the one entering without the other. And I think that this is still some years ahead until we can see eventually maybe a membership. But they're very good partners. And I mean, NATO depend heavily on them on many areas, and their contributions to ISAF and to also, I mean, many other parts of NATO's forces are extremely important. But the collective security will also remain only for members.
Thank you very much. These issues are at the top of the agenda here. We've just hosted the German defense minister. We've been doing a lot of work with the Swedes and Finns on their security and defense as well. There are more questions in the audience, but unfortunately I know we have to wrap this up, so I'm going to ask those who I didn't get to. Hopefully we can use your questions in the next panel. Madam Minister, thank you so much for your thoughts. Thank you so much for laying out your views for the alliance. I think that we all feel that with what's happening right now, there is a bit of renewed attention to the NATO summit as we go to Wales, and it's imperative to take advantage of that opportunity to get it right. If we don't have the underlying recognition of the same urgency and what's at stake, it's hard to get to the right strategy, and I think your voice has really added to that debate. So please join me in thanking the Minister for her time and her comments. Thank you very much.